Y las moriscas.
Hello and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a series for IHSHG, examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In the last episode, we covered the golden age of Islam under the Abbasid Caliphate and saw how this remarkable dynasty ushered in an age of economic, scholarly, and cultural excellence for the Islamic world, and became one of the greatest polities of the early Middle Ages. We also examined the challenges they faced in running both a centralized empire that spanned a size comparable to Rome, and managing a centralized court without power being abused. Today, we're going to take a break from our usual chronological timeline and focus instead on another significant power from the same period as the Abbasids, that rose from humble beginnings to become a powerful, cultured state, with a legacy that would resonate even into the modern day. This power was al-Andalus, the Islamic kingdom that existed on the Iberian Peninsula from the start of the 8th to the end of the 15th century. Even into the modern day, this medieval polity has enormous cultural and political significance. It has been formative in the shaping of Portuguese and Spanish culture and how each country views, and indeed debates, the trajectory of their own history. Furthermore, the notion of a society that accommodated a vibrant mixture of cultures, languages, and religions has provided an important touchstone for those calling for a more inclusive and tolerant culture in the West today, as well as modernists and reformists in Islamic countries. Of course, there's also plenty of fascinating historical ideas to explore as well. This region saw a meteoric rise from a reasonably remote outlier state to one of the most powerful Islamic polities in the period, only to fall again dramatically in a matter of decades. It was also the place where the Umayyad dynasty, ousted from power in the 750s by the Abbasids, began their rule anew and created for themselves a second empire focused on Cordoba instead of Damascus. In 920, the Prince Abd-ar-Rahman III also took the bold step of declaring himself Khalif, challenging seriously for the first time the legitimacy of the ruler in Baghdad to wield the title of the Prophet's deputy and successor. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, this was a society that took influences from a broad variety of religions and regions of the world, creating a fascinating meeting and coexistence of ideas and cultures. It's worth mentioning too that this was the longest continual encounter between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in history, at nearly 800 years, longer than both the Ottoman rule over Europe and Tunisian rule over Sicily. This is therefore an enormous and extremely complicated topic, and I felt in the production of this episode that it wouldn't be right to try to cram all of this incredible region's history into just one brief podcast. Therefore, in this episode, we will examine the first 4 centuries of Islamic rule in Iberia, from the initial conquest to the middle of the 11th century, when the revived Umayyad Caliphate fell apart. Although I will do my best to cover as much of the period as thoroughly as I can, I will inevitably leave gaps. So if you have any suggestions for topics that you'd like to see covered in more depth, do feel free to reach out to the IHSHG with your ideas. And speaking of which, this podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Do be sure to check out their website, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. So, let's begin. As you may recall from the second episode of our podcast, the start of the 8th century saw the early caliphate's second major wave of expansion, going out into Central Asia, northern India, and China in the east, and northern Africa in the west. It was in the latter series of conquests, concluded in 698, that the Berbers of the Sahara were brought into the fold of Islam, and the borders of the caliphate's lands were stretched as far west as modern-day Algeria, with the Tunisian city of Kairouan serving as the major base of operations in this region. For the governor of North Africa, however, one Musa ibn Nusayr, and the newly recruited Berber army that had helped him rise to power, this was not far enough. An attempt to expand the boundaries of Islam even further west began in the first decade of the 8th century, pressing up through Morocco into the Iberian Peninsula that held the promise of new lands for the army to claim as their own. At the time, the Iberian Peninsula was under the rule of the Visigoths, an organized band of warriors from the Black Sea that migrated here after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Adopting Catholicism in the early 6th century, this group attempted to rule their newly conquered land with a mixture of their own customs and the infrastructure Rome had left behind. The Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, had managed to take control of the southern and eastern coasts of Iberia for a short time, but this was abandoned in the mid-7th century as the first waves of Islamic conquest forced them to retreat back to their main heartlands in Greece and Anatolia. Now, a century later, divided among themselves and ruled by the ineffectual King Roderick, this group offered little resistance to the waves of conquest that allowed a Berber army under the command of Tariq bin Ziyad to establish a foothold in the peninsula by 711. A year later, the Visigothic capital of Toledo, alongside the city of Zaragoza, was conquered, with the archbishop of the latter fleeing to Rome to escape the violence. Nusayr returned to the Umayyad Caliphate a hero, with booty and prisoners to present to the Caliph al-Walid I. By 713, the Berbers were an established power, who were negotiating with local lords for land and tribute. One of these contracts was with a local magnate named Theodemir, and gives us an idea of how the conquering army dealt with amenable rulers. Theodemir's lordship was guaranteed, and his people were promised safety and freedom to practice Christianity in peace. In return, Theodemir was expected not to help or support the enemies of the conquering army, and to give tribute similar to what he had previously paid to the kings of the Visigoths to the new power. This tribute, incidentally, could be paid in silver coinage, as one might expect, but also in kind, with goods such as wheat, barley, vinegar, honey, olive oil, and a kind of unfermented grape juice known as must being offered to the conquering powers. This was often how cities were absorbed into the Islamic fold. Before the army descended, the ruler was given the choice to surrender. If they did, the army would simply occupy the city, and the ruler would be reinstated as a client of the caliphate, ruling his people in a similar enough way to how they would have been before, and giving regular tribute to the governor. Resistance, however, meant that the city was fought for, and if the Berbers won, they would customarily kill every man in the city and enslave every woman and child. This was a horrific practice, but it's worth noting that across the early medieval world, this was a fairly standard way to treat the population of a conquered city. The Berbers were certainly not alone in doing this. It was a grim reality of many cultures around the world at the time. The contract between Theodemir and Ibn Ziyad is worth noting too, as it survives to us as one of the few written sources for this period. Indeed, it's worth noting that this account only comes to us through a few select sources of information, as it's only in the 9th century that we start to get substantial evidence for this period. As well as the contract, Christian writings on the fall of the Visigoths also survive to us, as well as archaeology that bears the hallmarks of siege warfare and fighting, that suggests a rapid, aggressive move to take over the peninsula. On the subject of sources for this period, there's an interesting myth around the conquest that's worth sharing, as it gives us an insight into the way that both sides came to understand the rapid takeover of Iberia. It states that when the first Visigothic king came to Toledo, he brought with him the treasures of Solomon, including a sizable, gem-encrusted table, and locked them in a tower with a sturdy padlock to prevent access to them. Every king thereafter added their own lock to the door to secure it further, warning that a terrible fate befell anyone who tried to break the doors open. Roderick, the final king, disobeyed the warnings, however, and broke the then 26 padlocks on the door to find out what was inside. Upon entering the treasure chamber, he saw a large fresco of Berber soldiers riding forward to war. I discovered a note on the bejeweled table of Solomon, stating that in opening the door, he had doomed his kingdom to fall into the hands of the men depicted in the fresco. Sadly, we have no evidence of such a tower ever existing, but both Islamic and Christian sources use this myth in discussing the conquest for different reasons. For Islamic writers, it was evidence that God had ordained their coming to coincide with an impotent non-Islamic ruler to return the land to proper order. The Christians, reflecting back, it was a cautionary tale for the ages, and a means to explain why God would allow a pious people to lose their land to invaders outside of the fold of the church. This is fascinating, as this is a rare example of not just a foundation story, but one that two different cultures, and indeed sides of a conflict, were able to use to come to terms with the lightning-fast conquest of the region. By 718, the entire peninsula had been taken over by the Berbers, although their power base was firmly in the south of the country, around the city of Cordoba, that would go on to be the epicenter of Islamic rule in the Iberian world. The north would be something of a borderlands, where, away from the main locus of power, resistance would come in the form of both minor lords from the Islamic world vying for independence, as well as what remained of Christian powers in the region. These areas will be given the name Thogor, or March Estates, and were administered by generals instead of civilian bureaucrats. In the 720s, the Berbers tried to take this even further, and began raiding into the south of present-day France. It was only in 732, at the Battle of Poitiers, that resulted in a victory for the Franks under Charles Martel, that the raids into France stopped. As I mentioned in the first episode, this moment has truly captured the imagination of historians, as it presents a fascinating what-if scenario. It's difficult to discern what the exact fallout of the events of Poitiers could have been if Charles Martel hadn't won the field, owing to the fact that what-if predictions become increasingly difficult to make accurately the further one travels in time from the event. But it's fascinating nevertheless to imagine how different the early Middle Ages might have been with an Islamic presence in France and maybe even no Carolingian Empire at all. That notwithstanding, the speed that this conquest happened was undoubtedly impressive. The armies of Ibn Ziyad had achieved in less than a decade what it took the legions of Rome 2 centuries to manage. This was in part due to the fact that Iberia in the 8th century had 2 key elements that gave a decisive advantage to any conquering army. Good infrastructure, through the roads and aqueducts that made it easy for the armies of North Africa to move freely through the land, as well as a fragmented and divided kingdom that could be picked off one piece at a time without offering a united resistance. This latter point, however, is worth keeping in mind. Unlike the centralized lands of Eastern Rome and Persia that had fallen to Islamic rule up until this point, Iberia was altogether more decentralized, and lords here wielded more power on a local basis than their Eastern counterparts. This also frustrated the traditional model of Islamic conquest that relied on there being clear centers of power that could be linked together and ruled as one entity. Although this made Iberia easy to conquer, this would later be a veritable thorn in the side of governors thereafter, as we will later see. In the early years of Islamic Iberia, from 711 to 755, it was seen as a regular province of the Caliphate like any other, albeit on the very fringes of Islamic society. It was briefly lost from 740 to 743 during a Berber revolt, and did get caught up in the fighting between the Qais and Kalb factions at the end of the Umayyad dynasty. But otherwise it seemed like a somewhat unremarkable part of the Islamic world. It was poorer than the lands that had been conquered up until this point, as one of the provinces of Rome that suffered the collapse of the Western Empire, with economic production being small-scale and local, and very few cities as big as those found in the east. This was somewhat problematic for the rulers of al-Andalus, due to the fact that collecting taxes here was much harder than in more urbanized parts of the Caliphate. And there weren't the same kinds of large cities that could be leveraged as bases of power. This was, naturally, made harder by the need to set up a system of government from scratch, and for nearly a century, al-Andalus lacked the sophisticated political and economic structures of the broader Caliphate. The land was balkanized even further by three additional complicating factors. First, the presence of Berbers after the conquest had finished, who were relegated to the land outside of the boundaries of cities as Arab elites took the urban centers. This marginalization in part led to the 740 revolt and created an uneasy tension between Arabs and Berbers that would continue throughout the period. In addition to this, the mid-8th century saw waves of migration from areas such as Umayyad Syria, with people coming for the opportunity of new lands to be taken and cultivated. This in turn made it harder to centralize and regulate the land, with the coming of new settlers who held small holdings of their own. Finally, many of the old Visigothic lords remained and became clients of the governor of al-Andalus, known in sources as Umayyad, and they too had to be negotiated with to retain a balance of power. Between all these factors, al-Andalus represented more closely a feudal state comparable to the kind found in Europe, with the governor acting as more of a primus inter pares, who had to negotiate and balance the interests of the small holders under him. The status quo, however, was not to last, and the growth of al-Andalus from marginal states to regional superpower began with the exile and flight of a disgraced dynasty, the Umayyads of Syria. As you'll recall from the last episode, in 754, the Umayyads were violently ejected from power by the Abbasids of Khorasan, who set up a dynasty of their own, centralized around Iraq. Despite their best efforts to vanquish every member of the family line, however, the Umayyad name survived in the form of the grandson of the last Umayyad Khalif, Abd al-Rahman bin Muawiyah, later known as Abd al-Rahman I. He fled to North Africa, and then to al-Andalus, to become emir or prince of the province in 755, after winning the support of the Berber soldiers in the region, as well as factions opposing the unpopular governor Yusuf al-Fihri. Al-Fihri's clan tried to revolt for 2 decades after the government's deposition, but without much luck. From this point onward, al-Andalus began to run itself independently of the Caliphate of Baghdad, as the new Khalif al-Mansur made little effort to try to bring Iberia back into the fold of Islam. It was here too that the Umayyads were able to relaunch their dynasty afresh, producing a remarkably stable line of rulers from father to son, with little substantial interruption all the way up to the Fitna of 1013. As we know from the last episode, this kind of smooth transition in power was very rare in the Islamic world, and was undoubtedly an impressive feat. The initial years of Umayyad reign were difficult. Abd al-Rahman I was forced to rely on a paltry tax base around Cordoba and Seville, and had to spend much of his early years quelling the rebellious Toghor states to the north, as the tiny Christian kingdom of Asturia began to fight back against Islamic rule over Iberia. His son al-Hakam I fared little better, with 3 separate attempts to depose him in 15 years, one in 805, another in 818, and a third in 822, after he tried to expand the emir's tax base. Al-Hakam is reported to have been very heavy-handed in responding to these conspiracies. In 805, he had 72 conspirators crucified, and after the events of 818, he had an entire quarter of Cordoba flatlined and turned into farmland. Despite these difficulties, though, there was still some progress, with the 2 emirs being able to commission a number of impressive buildings in and around Cordoba, including, most iconically, the Great Mosque of Cordoba. This building is fascinating on a number of different accounts. When first commissioned, it lacked many of the hallmarks that we might expect from a mosque. There was no dome, for example, and the call to prayer was announced on top of a small raised platform called a sawma'ah instead of a minaret. Odder still is the fact that the mihrab doesn't point to Mecca. Instead, it points due south. The reason for this is hotly debated, but the most widely accepted interpretation of this was that the Umayyads wished to present Cordoba as a second Damascus, with a mihrab pointing in the same direction as it would in Syria. Despite these curious details, however, this was an impressive commission, and the mosque would continue to be built on and added to as the Umayyads continued their reign over al-Andalus. This building is also a classic example of the way that different architectural styles from different cultures were often used in conjunction with each other, producing the iconic Mosarab style that al-Andalus is still well known for today. It's believed, for example, that the iconic red and white striped arches in the prayer hall were based on Visigothic archways found in churches and palaces before the conquest in 711, and many buildings in this period likewise integrated Western Roman styles due to the fact that Roman stonework was widely repurposed. Although the first 2 emirs found some difficulty in establishing themselves in their new lands, the third emir, Abd al-Rahman II, would overcome the issues of governing this part of the Islamic world and begin to nurture it into one of the great powers of the early Middle Ages. Coming to power in 822, he introduced a number of key reforms that quickly elevated the status of al-Andalus over the years. He brought in a centralized bureaucracy, similar to that in Baghdad, but with the head of the emir's household staff, the Hajib, being the main executive instead of a wazir. He also steadily introduced taxes like those found in the East, never going too far too fast so as to isolate local lords and give them a reason to revolt. When it came to local rebellions, he was more forgiving than his predecessor. When Merida and Toledo rebelled in 835 and 837 respectively, the emir forgave the rebels after defeating them, although he did build forts in each city and commissioned the town of Murcia that he filled with Arab loyalists. He also began to expand the paltry force of 2,000 cavaliers that acted as the emirate's standing paid army, importing slave boys from Europe that were trained as elite soldiers and courtiers in the service of the emir. In 836, he also expanded the Great Mosque further, enlarging the prayer hall and adding a moksura, a walled-off section of the hall where the emir could pray without being seen, something for both his personal safety and to ensure that he didn't draw attention from his subjects, so that only Allah would be revered in the mosque. Abd al-Rahman II also took a keen interest in the world outside of al-Andalus. He tapped into trading networks and began to rapidly increase his kingdom's wealth, even at one point buying a necklace that used to belong to the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid. In the mid-9th century, he also warded off Viking raids in Seville in 844, Algeciras in 859, and Pamplona in 861, as well as in 858 satisfying a ransom issued when Vikings captured the wives of the governor of Melilla. Despite these scuffles, he managed to negotiate trade with the seafarers, who brought a steady supply of goods, including slave boys, to the new standing army. In 840, diplomacy with Byzantium opened up too, with the two powers exchanging gifts and artisans for palaces and royal commissions. Like the Emperor of Byzantium, Abd-ar-Rahman II also took to the practice of issuing silks to his most loyal courtiers and demanding a personal monopoly over revenue from its production and sale in his land. He also took a keen interest in nurturing an elite culture modelled on the tastes of Baghdad, something that was greatly helped with the arrival of the Persian poet Ziryab, who until his death in 857 was a leading light in court culture. Ziryab commissioned a large conservatoire to train performers for the courts in fashionable musical styles, the most notable alumni of this being the Qiyans, Hebrew slave girls who sang songs in a dazzling variety of languages, including Sephardi, Hebrew, Arabic, Spanish, and even Norse for the court. There are a variety of fantastic recordings of their music online, so do check this out if you'd be interested to experience the sounds of the Andalusian court for yourself. In addition to this, Ziryab brought in a number of fashionable practices from Iraq, including new styles of lutes for music, Baghdadi recipes for the emir's kitchens, new hairstyles, different clothing for each season, and even for the first time, toothpaste. This, however, was slightly different from the modern hygiene product. It was designed more as a chewable capsule for freshening breath and, according to Arabic medical texts from the period, strengthening gums. To make it, a variety of spices such as cloves, nutmeg, fennel, black pepper, rose petals, and cardamom were crushed with apple juice and sandalwood. There was no one recipe, and every medical scholar suggested something different, but it was nevertheless an interesting innovation in a time without modern dental practices. Under Abd-ar-Rahman's son Muhammad, the growth of the new emirate continued. Under him, the tax base and core professional soldiers began to swell, and a single law school was established too in the Maliki tradition that offered one streamlined interpretation of Sharia law without the infighting that was going on under the Abbasids. Scholarship in this period also began to flourish, with the library at Cordoba rapidly growing in size and scope. Sadly though, this wasn't to last, and under Muhammad's son Abdullah, the fledgling kingdom split apart into a vicious civil war. The origins of this lay, once again, in the troubled Thagor state to the north. Here, far away from the base of power in Cordoba, local lords were able to revolt and secede from Umayyad rule with relative ease, and fighting both between local lords and with the Christian kingdoms in the foothills of the Pyrenees was a perennial issue of living here. This was possible as, unlike in other parts of the Islamic world, Iberia had an established tradition of decentralized power and local magnates being able to exercise degrees of their own authority with little trouble. This was possible as, unlike in other parts of the Islamic world, Iberia had an established tradition of decentralized power and local magnates being able to exercise degrees of their own authority with little trouble. Iberia in this period didn't yet have the large, interconnected network of cities either, found in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, allowing local centers to operate on a more self-sufficient and local basis. In times of strength, local lords could jump on the bandwagon of the ascendant state and share in the wealth and influence that loyalty offered. But in more troubled times, they could retreat to their bases of power and consolidate their strength in the absence of a centralized authority. Many local lords were also closer to groups outside of the Arab elite in Cordoba. Some were Berbers, and others had a mixture of Islamic and Visigothic ancestry. These lords tended to be treated as others on account of their heritage, which most likely eroded their confidence in the ability of the emir to fully represent their interests. All this created an ideal climate for revolts and pressure against the ruling dynasty. It's also worth noting that, although the emirate was beginning to centralize, this process was by no means complete, and if local rulers or military groups felt that they were being excluded from the center of power, they could more easily break away here than in other parts of the Islamic world. Revolts began at the end of Abd al-Rahman II's reign, starting with the commanders of the states of Tudela, who revolted twice in 843 and 847. Then the cities of Merida and Toledo once again stood against Umayyad rule in the 860s, only to be put down in 868 and 873 respectively. After that, the 880s saw three governors successfully break away from Cordoba: Ibn Marwan al-Jaliki in Badajoz, Ibrahim ibn al-Hajjaj in Seville, and Umar bin Hafsun in Malaga. A string of other local power brokers followed, climaxing in a fragmented network of local power bases in the 890s, held together in name only by a weak and indecisive emir Abdullah. The infighting and division would continue until 912, in which time the progress of the flourishing emirates came to a grinding halt. Thankfully, this wasn't to last, and the man who would reverse this division would be Abdullah's son, Abd al-Rahman III, one of the most iconic rulers of this period. Under him, not only did the divisions end, but al-Andalus would be catapulted into the status of a regional superpower to rival the great empires of Byzantium. Abbasid Baghdad, and Fatimid Egypt. Abd al-Rahman III came to power in 912 and aggressively campaigned to restore his fragmented terrain. He took back Cordoba and the surrounding Guadalquivir Valley in 914, and went on to conquer Bobastro in 928, Badajoz in 930, and Toledo in 932. Instead of punishing or disgracing the lords he defeated, he reinstated them to their positions as governors in the new imperial bureaucracy, so that they would owe their power solely to him. This was coupled with a wide-ranging series of reforms and lavish expenditures, such as a network of irrigation that led to a boom in Andalusian agricultural production, as well as an expansion of the elite slave soldiers in the caliphal palace, becoming as many as 60,000 by the end of his reign. The Library of Cordoba also soared to remarkable heights, gaining 44 volumes of 50 folios each by the middle of the 10th century, a size to put it on par with the Byzantine Library of Constantinople, and even, to a lesser extent, the main library in Baghdad. The second key area of Abd al-Rahman's rulership was foreign policy and military conquest. From 916 onwards, he launched regular campaigns into the northern Christian kingdoms of Iberia, as well as Morocco, in order to expand Andalusian power in North Africa. This latter movement was especially important following the rise of the Fatimids in the 920s, who, before settling in Egypt in 969, moved aggressively west into modern-day Tunisia and Algeria, taking the major trading city of Kairouan and threatening Andalusian access to the Sahara trade route down to the oasis towns of Western Africa, a highly profitable source of gold, ivory, and salt that was, arguably, as important as the Silk Roads for the Mediterranean world's economic development. To check the advance of the Fatimids, Abd al-Rahman recruited coalitions of Berber tribes, as well as creating defensive ports such as Tarifa and Tortosa, as well as reinforcing the coastal towns of Ceuta and Melilla with sea defenses. In addition, closer diplomatic ties were forged with the Byzantine Empire in 949, a power similarly cautious about the rise of the new Shiite polity. The two exchanged envoys and gifts, one notable example being a remarkable Greek botanical text sent to Cordoba by the Emperor Constantine VII. Status and building was also important to Abd al-Rahman III. In 929, to consolidate his authority and celebrate his string of military victories, he took the bold, if not to say remarkable move, of declaring himself the true Caliph and granting himself the title Amir al-Mu'minin, or Commander of the Faithful, and the caliphal name al-Nasir li Dinillah, he who fights for the faith of God. This was a serious power move that allowed Abd al-Rahman to do several key things. Through this title, he could revive the Umayyad claim to the caliphate and make a stand against the Abbasids that had exiled his family and the Fatimids that claimed the caliphate as Shiites. It also gave him an air of legitimacy above the local lords of al-Andalus, something he could leverage when calling for union within his domain. In addition to this title, building was also a large part of his image overhaul. In 951, the new Caliph refurbished the great mosque of Cordoba, adding the first true minarets to the building, arguably in both defiance of the Shiite denunciation of minarets in Fatimid Egypt, as well as an attempt to emulate and supersede the spires of Cordoba's churches. In addition, in 940, Abd-ar-Rahman commissioned an enormous pleasure palace on the slopes of the Guadalquivir Valley, outside of the bustling centers of Cordoba. In this period, it had become fashionable for aristocrats to commission munyats, countryside lodges that served as villas, hunting reserves, and retreats away from the increasingly growing and crowded cities that were the centers of their political power. It is in this spirit that Abd-ar-Rahman constructed his palace, although naturally, being a new Caliph, this was a country retreat quite unlike any other. Named the Medinat al-Zahra, or City of Brilliance, it was an enormous three-tiered stronghold, complete with sumptuous living quarters, a gorgeous enclosed garden, and even a menagerie, fish pond, and aviary for the Caliph's personal pleasure. In addition to this, the lower strata of the palace functioned as a walled city in its own right, complete with mosques, markets, workshops, baths, stables, gardens, and residential areas. It was an enormous undertaking, with 10,000 laborers alone required to dig the foundations. Tons of marble were imported from North Africa and stripped from Roman ruins as spolia, and the finest artists were commissioned to use the latest styles and best materials to build this enormous pleasure palace. One of these even included a Byzantine bishop, who oversaw the implementation of interior decorations in the style of the imperial palace in Constantinople. A number of high-profile showpieces were also commissioned for the palace, such as a Byzantine-style pneumatic bronze throne that would lift the Caliph into the air as dignitaries bowed to him, as well as a bowl of liquid mercury that would catch the light in the reception hall and rock about, causing the light to flash across the marble ceiling. One diplomat visiting the court compared it to lightning and commented that it awed and shocked those in reception to the Caliph. Several elements were also designed to allude to the Caliph's closeness to God, the most prominent of which perhaps being the palace garden. It was a secluded space that could only be accessed via the Caliph's personal quarters, and gave him a full landscape view of not just the palace, but of Cordoba and the surrounding valley too. The idea being an allusion to paradise, being a place hidden from all but the most worthy. The garden's layout was designed to engage the senses. From a raised height, viewers could enjoy the ordered rows of greenery and flowers, the network of water features with bronze fountainheads shaped like lions, deers, and gazelles, and fine stonework made from porphyry and marble. Other senses were engaged too. Walking through the garden, one would hear birdsong and trickling water, smell the flowers, and feel the breeze of the elevated space. Such an area of remarkable beauty, in such close proximity to the Caliph's own personal quarters, accessible to only those that he allowed, helped him to project the idea of personal closeness to the divine in a way that no other power on earth could match. A powerful statement about his place on earth and relationship with the divine. This was therefore the jewel in the crown of a thriving society that by the 960s was one of the foremost centers of trade, learning, and culture in the Mediterranean world. Cordoba's population rose to be comparable to Constantinople's and almost as high as Baghdad's, and the country as a whole saw a massive surge in economic production and trade. The raw materials of the Iberian countryside were put to good use. Lead, iron, and mercury were dug up for mining and metalwork. Wool, felt, and linen were used for textiles, and leatherwork, glasswork, and ceramics were all produced and exported across the Islamic world. On the subject of ceramics, this included famous plates issued by the Caliph, with the word power or al-mulk decorating the ware. Some of these goods gained a true reputation for quality, such as the figs of Malaga and mercury of the mines of Al-Madin. Al-Andalus also saw a rise in imports of luxury goods, such as books, ivory, silk, and precious metals, leading to the commission of remarkable works of art, such as silver astrolabes, sizable ivory caskets, and even a manuscript of the Quran dyed a deep shade of blue. In addition to the economic developments, scholarship also thrived in this period as a result of renewed patronage, especially under Abd al-Rahman III's son al-Hakam II, an avid scholar and literary patron. Texts on astronomy, medicine, and logic were both imported and produced in major Andalusian cities, and its scholars established themselves as leading figures in the academic landscape of the Islamic world at the time. Perhaps the most famous being Maslamah, a scholar from Madrid responsible for a number of serious achievements. For example, he adopted the astronomical tables of the astronomer al-Khwarizmi to the Meridian of Cordoba in 979, translated Ptolemy's planisphere, and wrote several well-received tracts himself on the subject of astronomy. Other major innovations were pioneered too, including navigational and astronomical techniques that would give the technical knowledge to pave the way for the maritime empires of Portugal and later Spain. All of this demonstrated the remarkable wealth that al-Andalus commanded in this period, and is a testament to the extraordinary growth out from a marginal backwater just a century before. The other remarkable element of this society was the surprising degree of tolerance between the three Abrahamic faiths. Although it wasn't uncommon in the Islamic world for Islam, Judaism, and Christianity to coexist in relative peace, the legacy of al-Andalus's tolerance, known as convivencia, has grown to be one of the most iconic features in its writing and memorialization. In many ways, this was a necessity of ruling an area of the world like Iberia. With power being so fragmented, the easiest way to maintain control over this region was for rulers to work with different groups and communities so they wouldn't rebel, which, as we have seen, was fairly easy to do. Incorporating non-Muslims and recent converts into government, and promoting a generally tolerant culture was by far the easiest way to ensure that groups like these, that could easily feel marginalized or oppressed, had a stake in Andalusian society. Some Christians and Jews could become very powerful. The Catholic Bishop of Cordoba and the influential Jewish leader Hasdai ibn Shaprut were both high-ranking officials at the court of Abd al-Rahman III, and Ibn Shaprut was even the Caliph's own personal physician. Outreach beyond the territory of Al-Andalus was permitted too. Christian bishops were allowed to send missions to regions outside of the Islamic world, and Jews frequently wrote to their contemporaries in Fallujah in Iraq for spiritual advice, as by this point, the city had become a major center for Jewish scholarship. Those who had recently converted were also warmly integrated into power, with Al-Andalus having a higher number of non-Arab converts, or mawali, in positions of authority than any other part of the Islamic world. Furthermore, there is lots of evidence in this period of the three faiths freely intermingling. Marriage between the faiths was a fairly regular occurrence, and in some places there was even a mixing of practices and beliefs as the three faiths lived side by side. This was also reflected in the artistic styles and architecture of the region that would blend Roman, Byzantine, Visigothic, and Islamic styles, as we've already seen in the case of the Great Mosque of Cordoba and the Medina Zahra. It's worth stressing this inclusion wasn't always perfect, however. Christians and Jews still had to pay the jizya poll tax, which sometimes could be very steep, and were restricted in how they could build or even repair their places of worship. It was also illegal, and indeed punishable by death, to convert away from Islam, or to preach the message of any religion outside of Islam to other people. This was talked about with particular rancor in Christian texts, where priests and missionaries chafed against restrictions on the spreading of their faith. a vital element of Christianity across all dominions. It's worth remembering too that many chose to flee Andalusian rule so that they could live under rulers who shared their faith. That being said, this was still a remarkably accommodating society, where you could still be secure and indeed successful as a minority. And although Christians and Jews did face trouble at times for their faith, they were never actively persecuted or pressured into converting, something which sadly could not be said for the Christian societies of medieval Europe, where even believing in the wrong sect of the dominant faith could spell trouble. Therefore, towards the end of the 10th century, al-Andalus had emerged as a remarkable society with economic and scholarly clout and a commendable degree of tolerance and inclusion. Sadly, though, this golden age of Islamic Iberia was not to last, and the remarkable rise of the new caliphates quickly became unstuck, following the death of al-Hakam II in 976. In the Umayyad tradition, his son Hisham II was elected as Khalif to succeed him. The issue, though, was that Hisham came to the throne at the tender age of 15 and without any substantial experience of government. He was quickly pushed out of power by the seasoned Berber general Ibn Abi Amir, who, rather forcibly, offered to rule as regent for the young Khalif until he came of age. Ibn Abi even took a ruling name for himself, deciding on the title al-Mansur, and run the caliphate for 20 years without giving Hisham a chance to rule himself. Initially, this regency was made up of three prominent men: al-Mansur, another general named Ghalib, and al-Mushafi, the Hajib of al-Hakam II. This coalition, however, rapidly broke up as the three men began to compete against themselves for a greater share of power. Al-Mushafi was first to go, deposed and arrested by the other two regents. And then in 981, al-Mansur moved on Ghalib and had him removed too. During his time in power, al-Mansur aggressively attacked the Christian kingdoms to the north, sacking Barcelona in 984 and Santiago de Compostela in 997, where he had the bells of the cathedral stripped and returned to Cordoba, where they were hung in the Great Mosque. They would stay there until the sacking of Cordoba under the Reconquista in 1236. He also took a hard stance against Christian life on al-Andalus in a rare and indeed unfortunate moment of exception to the status quo of convivencia. Under him, executions for apostasy were at their highest rates in the region's history, and Christian writers universally denounced him for his intolerance. This continued in relative peace until 1009, with the ascension of Hisham's son, al-Muzaffar. Sensing weakness in the change of management, the local lords once again broke out in revolt against al-Mansur, rapidly splintering apart the caliphates and creating a situation not dissimilar to the events of the end of the 9th century. Eventually, 20 independent states would emerge, existing for 30 years in the period known as the Taifas. This sudden outburst of violence can in part be attributed to the climate in al-Andalus cultivated by al-Mansur's ebullient personality. Under him, the precedent had been set that anyone with enough military backing and political clout could wield power for themselves, and, in turn, the religious and legal status of the Khalif had been eroded. This was an extremely dangerous situation that rapidly swept away the delicate balance Abd al-Rahman III had worked so hard to establish. In the wake of this, the former tendency for local lords breaking off when trouble brewed once again resurfaced, and the region was plunged into division again. What replaced the caliphate was a constellation of minor powers that gradually reduced in number as larger cities consumed smaller ones, the biggest six being focused on the greatest cities of the region, such as Seville, Granada, Badajoz, Toledo, Valencia, and Zaragoza. These were run by a variety of local magnates. Some were military figures who wished to settle down in areas they had conquered or offer protection in return for loyalty. Others were local lords who simply converted their spheres of influence into independent polities of their own. Others still were high-ranking slaves who took advantage of the chaos to establish themselves as leaders in their own right. In general, this was a period of fragmentation, where infighting was the order of the day and economic output reduced drastically. There were some exceptions to this, however. Some patrons, such as the Dhul-Manids of Zaragoza, were able to commission works on a comparable level to the Umayyads in the 10th century. This was also a period of curious closeness between the Christian and Islamic powers of Iberia, as the two faiths would work together to fight regional rivals and consolidate each other's bases of power. Alliances in this period weren't always struck on faith lines, leading to fascinating exchanges between the two traditionally contending spheres of influence in Iberia. The most famous of these was perhaps El Cid, a Christian knight who built a reputation as a mercenary in Islamic armies, who would go on to become the source of several epic works of literature. The Taifas, however, were to be short-lived. In 1040, they were swept away by conquest from a group of Berbers from the northwest of Africa, known as the Almoravids. With a more rigorous, devout faith than their cosmopolitan predecessors, the Almoravids sought to restore a more religious piety to al-Andalus, ushering in a more austere age for the peninsula and renewed hostility with the Christian north. And at this point, the revival of Umayyad rule was firmly over. To conclude, although we end on a bitter note, the legacy of al-Andalus is nevertheless impressive. And it goes to show that in the study of Islamic history, it's important not just to restrict the focus to one continuous line of rulers and states. As al-Andalus shows, fascinating Islamic societies could thrive away from the centers of power in the Middle East and have their own stories to tell. Despite the enormous challenge of ruling an Islamic policy without the centralized cities and imperial networks found further east, the westernmost part of the Islamic world rose from humble roots to create an influential state with a tolerant climate and broad-reaching political and economic links. It is here that we will leave the story of this fascinating part of the world, to be revived in the 6th episode of our podcast, when we examine the Crusades from an Islamic perspective. Before we continue our chronological narrative, however, there is one more significant polity that deserves attention of its own. Therefore, in the next episode, we will be examining Egypt under the Fatimid Caliphate, and how the first major Shiite power of the Islamic world came into being and established a foothold in one of the wealthiest and most important regions of the world. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next episode.